Chapter 20 of the Boy Scouts in a Trapper's Camp by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Black Fox is Sold. The day in the lumber camp was all too short for all of the boys, but especially for Sparrer, to whom the cutting of the great trees, and the hauling of the logs, and the piling of them on the rollways on the banks of the river, ready for breaking out on the high water of the spring, was of absorbing interest. Hal and Upton were familiar with logging operations, having visited logging camps many times during their summers in the woods. The only novelty to them lay in the changed setting of the scenes produced by the snow. Sparrer was of just the type to win immediate favor with the rough, big-hearted lumberjacks, and they made him feel at home at once. They vied with one another in showing him things of interest, and his comments, colored with the slang of the city streets, afforded them no end of amusement. So it was with regret on all sides that at break of the following day the boys put their duffel on the big sled used for hauling in supplies and followed it themselves. Pat went with them to see them off at the train. With the last glimpse of the lumber camp as the sled entered the forest, a silence broken only by the tinkle of the bell on one of the horses, the muffled sound of their feet, and the slithering slide of the broad runners over the snow, fell on the little group. None felt in the mood for talking save the driver, and he soon subsided, failing to elicit more than monosyllabic responses. Pat was busy with thoughts of what his share from the sale of the black fox skin would mean to him and the furtherance of his ambitions for an education. But on his three guests the unfathomable mystery of all the wilderness had once more fallen and wrapped them in its spell. It was deeper for the knowledge that they were soon to break it with no certainty of when they might again surrender their spirits to it. They were going back to another world. Oddly enough, it was Sparrer who finally voiced the feeling of which both Upton and Hal were conscious, yet found no words to express. "It makes a fellow feel little," said he, "like he ain't nothing at all, and yet that inside him is something bigger than this." He swung one hand around in an all-inclusive sweep. "And it makes him feel clean inside, just like it is outside, and like he'd got to do big things, and little mean things hadn't got no place. And Sparrer was groping for words to make his meaning clear. "It gives a feller a funny feelin' that he ain't much, and yet that in some way he's bigger than the mountains. And if they is 1,000,000 years old, like people say, he is going to last a lot longer. Being out here makes me feel just like I do when I go into the church, and the sun comes through them colored windows, and the organ plays and lifts a feller right up, till he feels like he had wings and could fly if he only knew how to use them." Sparrer stopped abruptly and gazed with unseeing eyes off through the forest aisles. Pat looked over at the youngster with the light of understanding in his eyes. "Right, son," said he. "I know the feeling. This is the great cathedral that God has built for himself, and the littleness we feel is because of his own presence, and the sense of being greater than all this, the mountains, the lakes, and the rivers, is, I reckon, because he makes us feel that if he made all these things to last through millions of years, he isn't going to let his greatest work, man, perish in the little bit of time that makes a man's lifetime." The bell on the horse tinkled, the runners slithered over the snow, and no further word was spoken until the driver called, "Yonder's the clearin'. I reckon you fellers have got just about enough time to look the town over before the train comes." An hour later farewells were said, and the three boys stood on the rear platform of the Pullman, waving to Pat as the train pulled out. For some time after the straight form of the brawny young trapper in the dingy depot of the little village had faded from view, the boys stood watching the panorama of frozen wilderness. Then, reluctantly it must be confessed, they turned to the warmth and luxury of the car. "Say, hasn't it been great?" exclaimed Hal as he dropped into his seat. "Great doesn't express it at all," declared Upton. "It beats even the hunt for Lost Trail." As for Sparrer, he said nothing at all, but glued his face to the window that he might drink in as long as he could the beauty of this land of enchantment. where the test of a man was his ability to contend successfully with the forces of nature and to live within the law when beyond the watchful eyes of the law. This land where a man was gauged by his moral strength no less than by his physical strength. These 2 weeks in the heart of the wilderness had wrought a change in the lad's whole attitude toward life. His inherent love of battle for battle's sake had been given a new turn. His old ambitions to be a soldier or a prize fighter were forgotten in a new ambition, to be a woodsman, to pit his strength and courage and skill against the elemental forces of nature instead of against his fellows. In short, Spar had resolved that some day he would shake the dust of the city from his feet forever. He would become a guide and lumber boss like Big Jim, and so he watched the flying landscape and dreamed dreams, and they were wholesome. It had been agreed that Pat and Alex should attend to the marketing of the foxskin, Spar's share to be forwarded to him when the sale was made. The day after they reached New York, the operator at Upper Chain received a message over which he puzzled long. It was addressed to Pat Malone, and was as follows: "Wire best price you can get for skin, but do not sell it until you hear from me. Hal." It was 2 weeks before Pat's reply was received. Hal was back at school, but Mr. Harrison opened the message and smiled as he read it. It was brief and to the point. $2,000. What's up? Pat. Mr. Harrison rang for his private secretary. "Take this message and get it off at once," he said crisply. "Pat Malone, Upper Chain, will give $2,400 for skin. Ship at once by express. My check by next mail." Then he dictated a letter to Hal telling him of the success of their conspiracy, for the two had hatched a plan together. Hal's description of the events in Smuggler's Hollow had so delighted Mr. Harrison that he had at once exclaimed, "We've got to have that skin, my boy. As a piece of fur, it is worth as much to me as it is to anyone else. For sentimental reasons, it is worth more to me than it is to anyone else. I don't believe in mixing sentiment with business, my boy, but there are exceptions to all rules. This is one. Besides, I owe that young Irishman up there in the woods more than money can repay for what he has done in helping to make you what you are today. You have him wire the best price he can get, and I'll go at one better. And, by the way, you might suggest to that youngster who shot the beast that when he gets his share of the money, I'll be glad to invest it for him where it will earn more than it will in a bank." And this is how it happened that Pat, Alec, and Spar, with $800 apiece, experienced for the first time that sense of independence and power which comes with possession of wealth. For not even Mr. Harrison, with his millions, felt richer than they. To Alec it meant the realization of a cherished dream which included the ownership of a certain tiny farm. To Pat it meant the education he had set his heart upon, while to Spar it meant a better home, a lifting of some of the load from his mother's shoulders, and a further stimulating of an already awakened ambition to gain for himself a share in the higher and better things of life. Of course, when the story was told to the Blue Tortoise Patrol, Spar was more popular than ever. He was little short of a hero in the eyes of his companions, the more so because Upton was at pains to point out that the boy's good fortune was really due to his adherence to the scout principles which he had embraced, and to the moral victory which he had gained through the loyalty to the scout oath in the face of the hardest kind of temptation, the temptation when there is none to see either victory or defeat. A few weeks later, the damaged suit growing out of the automobile accident in Bronx Park was tried, and the Blue Tortoises were called as witnesses. Once more Spar distinguished himself, unhesitatingly picking out from a group of men the one whose face he had seen for just a fleeting moment in the big car racing away from the scene of the accident. So positive was his identification that the defense, which was based on the claim that the car had been taken without the owner's knowledge, crumbled then and there, for the man whom Spar identified was none other than the owner himself. As for Upton, he returned to his studies with renewed vim and determination, which in due time brought its reward, the scholarship on which he had set his heart. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. Well might the men of today as well as the men of tomorrow subscribe to this oath of the Boy Scouts of America, whether their lot in life be cast in the turmoil of the great city or the loneliness of a trapper's camp. End of Chapter 20. End of the Boy Scouts in a Trapper's Camp by Thornton W. Burgess. Recording by Keith Salis.